The billionaire's son was born deaf, until the maid revealed something that shook him. For years he paid fortunes to clinics that profited from his own son's silence. It was a simple woman, ignored by everyone, who dared to see what no one else would. And with a single gesture, she destroyed an empire of lies and made the boy hear for the first time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The rain beat against the windows of the office on the 23rd floor of the corporate building on Park Avenue. Edward Miller watched New York City spread out before him like an illuminated chessboard, each light representing a life, a dream, a battle. He had built his financial empire brick by brick, deal by deal, always guided by a single certainty. Everything in life could be controlled, predicted, and solved with logic and sufficient resources. 42 years of a flawless trajectory had proven this philosophy, until the day it all came crashing down. 6 years ago, life had torn away the only person who could make his heart beat out of sync with the rhythm of business. Julia hadn't survived childbirth. Complications arose without warning, and even with the elite medical infrastructure surrounding them, even with the top specialists in the country, she was gone, taking with her a light Edward didn't even know he needed. The baby survived, but the diagnosis came like a second stab wound. The boy was deaf. Deaf from birth, the doctors said, with that clinical tone that tried to soften the irreversible. Edward couldn't separate the two tragedies. It was as if Julia's absence had left his son in eternal silence, as if the universe had exacted too cruel a price. Gabriel grew up healthy, handsome, with his mother's green eyes, but he would never hear her voice. He would never hear the lullabies Julia hummed during her pregnancy, dreaming of the future. And Edward, trapped in his own guilt, turned his pain into a mission. If fate had taken his son's hearing, he would bring it back. With money, with science, with sheer stubbornness. The following years were a marathon of consultations across 3 continents: the Mayo Clinic, Boston, Johns Hopkins, the Cleveland Clinic. Edward flew with Gabriel to the most advanced medical centers on the planet. He accumulated diagnoses, underwent experimental procedures, and listened to dozens of specialists repeat the same sentence: profound congenital deafness with no prospect of reversal. But he wouldn't accept it. To accept would be to give up on the last link to Julia, to admit his powerlessness in the face of destiny, to acknowledge that not every problem had a solution. Through the power he had so carefully cultivated. The mansion in one of New York's most exclusive neighborhoods reflected its owner's state of mind. Sprawling, modern, with impeccable marble and glass finishes, the house was a monument to aesthetic perfection and emotional emptiness. The rooms were vast and silent, decorated with works of art that no one stopped to admire. There was no music, no laughter, no life pulsing within those walls. Silence reigned supreme, not as peace, but as a sentence. Gabriel lived in that sterile environment like a discreet shadow. At 6 years old, the boy had developed his own routines, his own inner world. He played alone in his immense room, surrounded by toys organized with military precision. Every object had its place, every activity its time. The household staff moved like well-trained ghosts, performing their duties without forming attachments. Edward had made it clear from the beginning: efficiency, discretion, emotional distance. He didn't want his son to get attached to people who might leave, as Julia had. But there was something everyone ignored, normalized by routine. Gabriel frequently brought his hand to his left ear with a fleeting expression of discomfort. The gesture was quick, almost imperceptible, and no one paid it any mind. After all, for a deaf child, what difference would an ache in the ear make? It was just another quirk, another detail lost in the automated daily life of that house. Edward spent little time at home. Work consumed his weeks, and when he returned, he interacted with Gabriel in a mechanical, formal way. He checked if he was fed, clean, healthy. He reviewed reports from therapists, checked his progress in sign language, approved new medical appointments. But he never played with his son, never sat on the floor beside him, never tried to enter the silent world Gabriel inhabited. To do so would be to confront his own failure, to admit he hadn't been able to protect his wife or his son. It was on a grey Tuesday in June that Maria Sanchez walked through the gate of that mansion for the first time. She had come through an employment agency, hired only for general cleaning services. She had no references from elite homes, no training in sophisticated domestic etiquette. She brought only the urgency of someone who needed to survive. At 31, Maria carried on her shoulders the weight of caring for her grandmother, Gloria, who had raised her after she lost her parents as a child. Her grandmother's health was deteriorating, and the costs of medication and medical care consumed every penny Maria could scrape together from her temp jobs. This job at the Miller family home was the highest pay she had ever been offered. The amount was enough to cover Grandma Gloria's medicine for months, maybe even pay for a surgery the doctors had been recommending. Maria knew she couldn't waste the opportunity. On her first day, she received instructions from the house manager, Mr. Peterson, a middle-aged man with a rigid posture and a watchful eye. He made the rules crystal clear: absolute punctuality, total discretion, and especially no interaction with the child. Gabriel was not her concern. Her job was to keep the house immaculate, nothing more. Maria agreed to everything, but in the first few days something deeply bothered her. She saw Gabriel wandering the halls, always alone, always silent. The boy's eyes weren't searching for non-existent sounds, but for something more intangible. Attention, presence, human warmth. He organized his toys with an almost adult-like precision, following routines as if he had been programmed to do so. And repeatedly he would bring his hand to his left ear, frowning for a moment before returning to what he was doing. That gesture awakened something in Maria. An old memory insisted on returning, like a poorly healed wound. When she was 10, she had a younger cousin everyone thought was deaf. The family suffered, sought treatments, resigned themselves to the diagnosis, until the day a more attentive doctor discovered it wasn't deafness, but a severe blockage in the ear canal, something that had gone unnoticed for years. When the problem was fixed, the boy heard for the first time. But those lost years never came back. There was also another, more painful memory. As a teenager, Maria had witnessed a situation where a neighborhood child was suffering, and she had noticed signs that something was wrong. But out of fear, insecurity, and the belief that it wasn't her place to interfere, she stayed silent. Weeks later, the situation worsened drastically, and although the child was helped in time, Maria carried the guilt for years of not having acted when she should have. She had made a silent promise to herself. She would never again stay silent. In the face of a child's suffering, if it was within her power to do something. In the following days, Maria began to watch Gabriel more closely, always discreetly, always between her tasks. The boy seemed to notice her presence differently than the other staff. When she cleaned near him, Gabriel would look up, curious. One morning, while she was mopping the hallway, he dropped a toy in front of her. Maria picked it up and handed it back with a smile. Gabriel didn't smile back, but something in his eyes changed, as if a small door had opened. Mr. Peterson, however, was always nearby. He noticed every movement, every second Maria lingered longer than necessary in a room. The warnings started subtly. She needed to be faster. She couldn't waste time with distractions. Maria felt the pressure, but something stronger pulsed within her. With each passing day, she saw Gabriel touch his ear more frequently, and at times the boy seemed genuinely bothered, bringing his hand to the spot with more insistence. One Sunday afternoon, when the house was emptier, Maria finished her tasks on the upper floor and went down to get cleaning supplies from the pantry. As she passed the library, she saw Gabriel sitting on the rug, surrounded by picture books he was flipping through alone. The boy touched his ear again, this time with more pressure, and Maria clearly saw the expression of discomfort he was trying to hide. Something inside her screamed that this wasn't normal, that there was something beyond the deafness, something everyone was ignoring because they already had a ready-made explanation. She approached slowly, crouching at a safe distance. Gabriel looked at her, and for the first time Maria saw silent tears streaming down his face. They weren't tears of ordinary sadness, but of a physical pain the boy didn't know how to communicate. Maria felt her heart clench. She wanted to hug him, to examine him, to do something. But Mr. Peterson's voice echoed down the hall, calling her back to work. She stood up quickly, but before leaving she held Gabriel's hand for a second, a brief gesture that said, "I see you." That night, Maria couldn't sleep. Lying in the small bed of her modest apartment in Queens, next to the room where Grandma Gloria slept with difficulty due to shortness of breath, she replayed the scene. Gabriel's eyes pleading for help, the repetitive gesture to his ear, the memory of her cousin, the promise she had made to herself. But she also thought of her grandmother, the expensive medications, the necessary surgery. If she lost this job, she would lose everything. And Mr. Peterson had already shown that any deviation from the rules would result in immediate dismissal. The following week was one of internal torment. Maria performed her duties perfectly, but with every encounter with Gabriel, her anguish grew. The boy began to seek her out with his eyes, to stay close when she cleaned. He left small drawings in places she would pass, like silent messages. Maria responded with discreet notes, simple drawings. It was an invisible communication, woven in the shadows of that immense, cold house. One day, while cleaning Edward's office during his meeting hours, Maria noticed a cabinet left ajar. Inside were folders upon folders of medical documents. She knew she shouldn't, but something compelled her. She quickly leafed through the papers, finding reports from various countries, all confirming the congenital deafness. But in an older, dusty folder, she found records from Gabriel's first few months of life. Among the notes, discreet observation from a pediatrician caught her eye. Possible obstruction in the left ear canal, detected at 4 months, further investigation required. Maria felt her blood run cold. Had the investigation been done? She flipped through more pages and found a reference to a specialized treatment center where Gabriel had been seen for years. But something about the names of the doctors and the clinic bothered her. She remembered reading reports about centers that profited by keeping patients in endless treatments, especially wealthy families willing to pay any price. They were just suspicions, but the doubt was planted. She put everything back, her heart racing. If that note was real, if there was truly something beyond the deafness, then Gabriel had been suffering needlessly for years, and she, a simple housekeeper with no medical training, would be the only person to notice. The weight of responsibility was crushing. If she did something, she would risk everything. If she did nothing, she would betray the child who placed a fragile and precious trust in her. Mr. Peterson began to intensify his surveillance. He approached her more frequently, questioning why she took so long in certain rooms, reminding her of the consequences. Curved disobedience. Maria felt the trap closing in. One evening, upon returning home, she found Grandma Gloria having more trouble breathing. Her grandmother held her hand tightly, saying she trusted her, that everything would be okay, because Maria always knew how to make the right choices. The words echoed in Maria's mind. Right choices. What was the right thing to do here? Protect her livelihood and her grandmother's health, or protect a child who was suffering in silence? Was it really a choice, or was it just fear disguised as pragmatism? She remembered her teenage years, when she had stayed, silent, the guilt she had carried. She couldn't repeat that, not this time. The next morning, Maria arrived at the mansion with a decision made. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew she wouldn't turn her back on Gabriel. The boy was waiting for her in the hallway with a new drawing, a house, a woman, and a boy smiling. There was no one else in the picture, just the two of them. Maria felt her eyes well up. This child had chosen her as his ally, and she would not abandon him. Gabriel touched, his ear again, this time with a more evident grimace of pain. Maria looked around, making sure they were alone. She knelt before him and, with gentle care, tried to externally examine his ear. Gabriel didn't resist. On the contrary, he tilted his head as if asking for help. With the light from the hallway, Maria could see something. It wasn't just deafness. There was something there. Something deep. Something that shouldn't be. Her heart pounded. The suspicion had become a visual certainty. At that moment, footsteps echoed on the stairs. Mr. Peterson was coming down. Maria stood up quickly, returning to her work as if nothing had happened. Gabriel looked at her with an expression she would never forget, hope mixed with desperation. The manager passed them without a word, but the look he gave Maria was a clear warning. That night, Maria didn't sleep again. Sitting at the small kitchen table with Grandma Gloria sleeping in the next room, she cried. She cried for the suffering child, for the impossible dilemma, for the injustice of having to choose between two lives she loved. But as she cried, something within her crystallized. It was no longer doubt. It was conviction. Gabriel needed her, and she would not fail him. In the following days, Maria began to observe the house's routine more closely. She knew she would only have one chance, a single opportunity to act. If she failed, she would lose everything. If she succeeded, she might save a child condemned to a silence that perhaps should never have existed. Fear paralyzed her, but faith propelled her, and slowly a plan began to form in her mind. Edward Miller, oblivious to it all, continued his routine of meetings and trips. He looked at his son from a distance, believing he was doing everything right, not realizing that the real answer was right in front of him, coming from the person he least expected. The absolute control he so prized was beginning to crack, and the crack was coming from the most unlikely source. The compassion of a woman invisible to his eyes, but crystal clear to the eyes of a child desperate to be seen. And so, as New York City pulsed outside with its chaotic mix of intertwined lives, inside that silent mansion, two souls prepared for an act of courage that would change everything. Destiny was in motion, and not all the money in the world could stop what was about to happen. The first rays of a July Thursday's sun streamed through the mansion's windows, illuminating the furniture with a cruel clarity. Maria arrived punctually, as always, but she carried a different weight in her chest. The decision was made, but the opportunity had not yet presented itself. Edward was flying to Washington, D.C. that afternoon and would be away for 3 days. Mr. Peterson had the weekend off. It would be the window of time Maria needed, but it also meant that if something went wrong, there would be no turning back. The night before, she had spoken at length with Grandma Gloria. Her grandmother, sensing her granddaughter's anguish, had asked what was troubling her. Maria, unable to lie to the woman who raised her, told her everything. The suffering child, the gesture at his ear, the discovery in the documents, the dilemma between her job and her conscience. She expected her grandmother to advise her to be prudent, not to risk their livelihood. But Grandma Gloria held her hands with the strength she still had left and said something Maria would never forget. "My child, I didn't raise you to be a coward. I raised you to be good. And sometimes being good hurts more than being smart. If you have the chance to take a child out of suffering, you do it. God doesn't put us in certain situations by accident. I'll be fine. I've always managed, and I'll keep managing. But you won't be fine if you turn your back on that boy." "That I know." The words echoed in Maria's mind as she cleaned the entrance hall. Gabriel appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly, his eyes searching for her. When he saw her, something in him lit up. The boy ran to her and for the first time hugged her legs, burying his face in her uniform. Maria felt tears threaten to escape. She stroked his hair slowly, looking around to make sure they were alone. Gabriel lifted his face and pointed to his own ear, then to her as if to say, "You know you can help." Edward walked past them carrying a briefcase, hurried, talking on the phone. He glanced briefly at his son, hugging the housekeeper, and something crossed his face, a fleeting expression. That could have been discomfort, or perhaps a glimmer of something he had buried long ago. The awareness that his son needed affection, not expensive treatments. But the call distracted him, and he continued to his car without a word. Gabriel let go of Maria and stood at the window watching his father leave, a small, lonely figure silhouetted against the morning light. Mr. Peterson spent the morning giving instructions for the period he would be away. Another, more senior housekeeper would take over supervision. She was a kind, less rigid woman who had always treated Maria with respect. This was an advantage, but it also meant Maria would have to act with extreme caution not to involve anyone else in her plan. The risk could not fall on others. The next 2 days were an agonizing wait. Maria feigned normalcy, carried out her tasks, but observed every detail of the house's routine. Gabriel's episodes intensified. The boy would wake up at night, crying without a sound, pressing his ear hard. The other housekeeper, concerned, tried to comfort him but didn't know what to do. Maria watched from a distance, feeling the urgency grow. Time was running out. On Friday night, alone in her apartment, Maria did something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. She knelt and prayed. She asked for courage, for wisdom, for protection for Gabriel. And she asked for forgiveness in advance for everything that could go wrong. Grandma Gloria, sitting in the chair beside her, also prayed, her trembling hands holding her rosary with devotion. The two women, united by faith and love, prepared for the next day. Saturday dawned overcast. Maria arrived at the mansion with her heart pounding. The supervising housekeeper was focused on her own tasks, and the other employees followed. Their usual routines. Gabriel sought her out early. He was carrying an old toy, a small stringed instrument he never played because he couldn't hear it. He handed it to Maria with a look that said, "I want to hear this." Maria took the toy and discreetly put it away. She waited until the afternoon, when the house settled into that slower rhythm that Saturdays brought. Gabriel was in his room, playing alone. She went upstairs with the excuse of cleaning the hallway. She entered the boy's room and slowly closed the door. Gabriel looked at her without surprise, as if he knew this moment would come. Maria knelt before him and, with slow, gentle gestures, signaled that she needed to examine his ear. Gabriel nodded, trusting. She led him to the window, where the natural light was better. With extreme care, using a small penlight she had brought from home, she looked inside his ear canal. What she saw made her hold her breath. There was something in there, something that wasn't a natural part of the body, something completely blocking the passage. It was so obvious that Maria couldn't understand how so many specialists had missed it. But then she remembered the documents, the suspicious clinic, the expensive treatments that dragged on without a cure. She remembered that sometimes evil comes not from incompetence, but from greed. Gabriel had been kept in silence on purpose because his deafness was profitable for those pretending to treat him. Anger and sadness mingled in Maria's chest, but she needed to stay calm. She had a few basic instruments she had gotten from a pharmacy, a simple ear-cleaning kit. It wasn't ideal, far from it, but it was what she had. She prayed one more time, asking for her hands to be guided. Gabriel remained still, trusting her in a way that broke her heart. With infinite patience, Maria began to work. Every movement was calculated, delicate, almost reverent. Gabriel whimpered softly at times, but didn't pull away. He understood somehow that this was necessary. The minutes felt like hours. Maria was sweating, trembling, but she didn't stop. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she managed to remove it. It was a severe obstruction, something that should have been detected and treated years ago. Maria carefully cleaned the area, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, blinking in confusion, as if something had changed, but he didn't know what. Maria picked up the musical toy he had given her earlier. With trembling fingers, she gently plucked the strings. The sound filled the room, soft and clear. Gabriel froze. His eyes widened. He whipped his head toward the sound, something he had never done before. Maria plucked again, this time louder. The boy stood up slowly, staggering, as if the world had shifted on its axis. He looked at the toy, then at Maria, then back at the toy, and then, for the first time in his 6 years of life, Gabriel opened his mouth and made a sound. It was imperfect, hesitant, but it was a voice. His voice. The boy brought a hand to his own throat, startled by the vibration, by the discovery that he could create sounds. Maria collapsed into tears, hugging him tightly, laughing and crying at the same time. It was a miracle she had witnessed, that she had helped bring about. Gabriel was crying too, but now his tears were of astonishment, of joy, of a new world opening up. But the joy was short-lived. Quick footsteps echoed in the hall. The door flew open. It was the supervising housekeeper, alerted by the strange sounds coming from the room. Seeing Maria hugging Gabriel, with instruments scattered around, she turned pale. "What did you do?" The question was loaded with panic and accusation. Maria tried to explain, but the words tumbled out. The other woman ran out, screaming for help, saying something terrible had happened. Within minutes, the house descended into chaos. Staff came running, phone calls were made, accusations flew through the air. Maria was forcibly separated from Gabriel. The boy screamed, a high-pitched, frightened cry he had never been able to make before, and that confused everyone present even more. Why was the deaf child screaming? What had this woman done? Maria was taken to a room and locked inside while they awaited instructions. Edward was contacted in DC and informed that a housekeeper had done something terrible to his son. He cancelled everything immediately and caught the first flight back. Mr. Peterson was called in, even on his day off. The situation escalated rapidly into something much bigger than Maria had imagined. Meanwhile, Gabriel was being examined by a doctor who had been called in a hurry. The professional, confused by the conflicting reports, performed a basic examination. That's when the first bombshell dropped. The boy could hear. The doctor tested him several times, incredulous. Gabriel responded to sounds, turned his head, reacted. The deafness, diagnosed for years as absolute and irreversible, had vanished. The doctor demanded to see all the old medical records. While the staff scrambled to find the documents, he meticulously examined Gabriel's ear. He found signs of a recent intervention, but also something more disturbing: old marks of a severe obstruction, scars in the ear canal that indicated a long-standing problem that had been ignored. His expression changed from confusion to controlled anger. Something was very wrong here, and it wasn't what the housekeeper had done, but what hadn't been done for years. Edward arrived like a hurricane on Saturday night. He stormed into the mansion demanding explanations, demanding to see his son, demanding that Maria be held responsible. But when he saw Gabriel, everything changed. The boy ran to him, and for the first time said, "Dad." The word was imperfect, more a sound than a proper word, but it was unmistakable. Edward froze. Gabriel repeated, touching his father's face, "Dad." Edward fell to his knees, holding his son, unable to process what was happening. Gabriel was talking. He was hearing. How? The doctor approached, his face grave. "Mr. Miller, we need to talk." The two locked themselves in the office with Mr. Peterson and the medical files. What was revealed in that room would change everything. The doctor, an ethical and experienced professional, showed Edward the old records. He pointed to the note Maria had found. Obstruction detected at 4 months, investigation recommended. Edward stared at the papers, not understanding. He had taken Gabriel to the best specialists in the world. How had this been missed? The doctor explained that it hadn't been missed. It had been deliberately ignored. He showed him the names of the professionals who had treated Gabriel in his early years. Some of them were associated with a long-term treatment clinic that had recently been investigated for questionable practices. The doctor couldn't prove malpractice without a full investigation, but the pattern was clear. Symptoms that could have a simple solution were turned into complex diagnoses, generating years of expensive and useless treatments. Gabriel had been a victim of a system that profited from his deafness. Edward felt his world collapse. He had spent a fortune, crossed continents, trusted blindly in titles and reputations, and it had all been an elaborate fraud. While he paid millions for useless treatments, his son suffered from something that could have been resolved years ago. The guilt he carried for Julia's death multiplied 1,000 times. He had failed her, failed his son, failed at everything that mattered. And then he remembered Maria, locked in the room, awaiting punishment. The woman everyone treated as invisible, who earned a fraction of what he paid the fraudulent doctors, was the only one who had seen the truth. She had risked everything, her job, maybe even her freedom, to save a child who wasn't even her responsibility. Edward asked for her to be brought to him immediately. When Maria entered the office, her face was marked by tears and exhaustion. She expected to be fired, maybe even sued. But Edward said nothing. He just looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. And then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He apologized. Apologized for not seeing what she saw, for not hearing what she heard, for not loving his own son the way she had. Maria, bewildered, tried to explain that she hadn't done anything special, that anyone would have done the same. But Edward shook his head. No, not anyone. I didn't. Surrounded by infinite resources, he had gotten lost in the search for grandiose solutions, ignoring the obvious. Meanwhile, she, with her simplicity and courage, had seen the truth. The doctor suggested that Gabriel undergo more comprehensive exams at a reputable hospital, not the clinics that had treated him before. Edward agreed immediately, but before anything else he wanted to know more about Maria. Who was she? Why had she risked so much? Mr. Peterson, still reeling from the turn of events, mentioned that she cared for a sick grandmother, that she desperately needed this job. Edward felt another wave of shame. She had so little, and yet she had given so much. He asked about her grandmother, about her health problems, about the costs. Maria, reluctantly, told him about Grandma Gloria, about the necessary surgery, about the difficult years. Edward listened in silence, and when she finished, he simply said, "That will be taken care of. Your grandmother will have the best care. And you're not losing your job. In fact, you'll never have to worry about money again." Maria couldn't believe it. She tried to refuse, saying she hadn't done it for a reward, but Edward was firm. It wasn't a reward. It was the least he could do for someone who had saved his son when he himself had failed. The fraudulent doctors would be exposed, and Gabriel would have the chance to live the life he always deserved. But deep down, Edward knew that money couldn't fix what was truly broken. He had lost 6 years of his son's life. 6 years where he could have been a real father, where he could have loved, played, built memories. Instead, he had turned his home into a mausoleum, his son into a project, and himself into a stranger. That night, after everyone had left, Edward went into Gabriel's room. The boy was awake, sitting up in bed, experimenting with sounds. He tapped objects and listened to the noises, mesmerized. When he saw his father, he smiled. Edward sat beside him, and for the first time in 6 years, father and son sat together in silence. But now, it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer a punishment. It was peace. Gabriel took his father's hand and placed it on his own chest, near his heart. Then he placed his small hand on Edward's chest, feeling the heartbeat. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. We're alive. We're together. We can start over. Edward hugged his son and, for the first time since Julia had gone, allowed himself to cry. He cried for everything he had lost, for everything he had wasted, for all the mistakes he had made. But he also cried with gratitude. Gratitude for a simple woman who had seen where he was blind, who had acted where he remained inert, who had loved where he had forgotten how. Out in Queens, Maria arrived home and told Grandma Gloria everything. Her grandmother cried with relief and pride, saying she always knew her granddaughter would do the right thing. The two hugged for long minutes, exhausted but relieved. Maria's phone rang. It was Edward, confirming that everything would be arranged for Grandma Gloria. Furthermore, he wanted Maria to keep coming to the house, not as a housekeeper, but as someone important in Gabriel's life. Someone the boy loved and trusted. Maria accepted, still not fully believing it was all real. She lay down that night feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, the certainty that she had made a difference, that her existence mattered, that even though she was just one among thousands, she had changed a life, and in changing that life, she had also changed her own. As New York slept under the cloudy sky, 3 lives intertwined in a new configuration. A man learning to be a father, a boy discovering sound, and a woman rediscovering her own worth. The road ahead would still be long, but for the first time in years there was hope where before there had only been silence. The next 3 months transformed the mansion in a way no architectural renovation ever could. Edward hired the best speech therapists, but this time with a different purpose. Not to cure a non-existent deafness, but to help Gabriel develop the speech that had been stolen from him. The boy absorbed everything with astonishing speed, as if his brain was starved for sound after so long enforced silence. The house, once a silent mausoleum, now echoed with new sounds. Gabriel loved making noise. He banged on pots and pans, played toy instruments, turned on the TV just to hear the voices. He laughed loudly, shouted when excited, and hummed imperfect melodies. Every noise was a celebration, a declaration of freedom. Edward, who once demanded absolute silence, now smiled at the sonic chaos his son created. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Maria came to the house 3 times a week, no longer as an employee, but as a fundamental presence in Gabriel's life. The boy greeted her with effusive hugs, pulling her by the hand to show her every new word he learned, every sound he discovered. She had become something between a second mother and a personal hero to him, the person who had freed him, who had believed in him when no one else did. Grandma Gloria underwent the necessary surgery at the best private hospital in New York. The doctors, initially skeptical due to her advanced age, were impressed with her recovery. Edward visited her personally, bringing Gabriel. The grandmother held the boy's hands and cried, saying that God worked in mysterious ways, using simple people to do extraordinary things. Gabriel, still learning to speak, just said, "Grandma, thank you." But those 2 words were enough to move everyone present. Edward quietly launched an investigation into the doctors and the clinic that had treated Gabriel for years. He hired specialized lawyers and medical auditors. What they uncovered was worse than he had imagined. The clinic ran a scheme where diagnoses were deliberately complicated to justify expensive, prolonged treatments. Desperate, wealthy families paid fortunes for empty hopes. Gabriel wasn't the only victim, just the most recent. The discovery brought a deep anger, but also a sense of purpose. Edward decided to expose everything, even knowing it would reveal his own negligence as a father. He would sue the clinic, seeking justice not just for Gabriel, but for all the deceived families. It was the way he found to turn his guilt into action, his shame into correction. But the real transformation was happening on another level, deeper and quieter. Edward started spending more time at home. He cut back on travel, delegated responsibilities, and reorganized his priorities. Every night he had dinner with Gabriel, even if the boy still ate messily and spoke in fragmented sentences. After dinner, the 2 would sit on the living room floor and play. Simple games, building blocks, drawing, things Edward had never done before. At first it was awkward. He didn't know how to play, how to talk to a child, how to enter the imaginative world of a 6-year-old boy. But Gabriel was patient with his father, just as Maria had been patient with him. Slowly, Edward learned to laugh at himself, to get dirty on the floor, to make funny voices, to build imperfect castles and celebrate them anyway. One evening, while they were putting a puzzle together, Gabriel stopped and looked seriously at his father. Edward, used to his son's liveliness, noticed the change in mood. Gabriel pointed to a photo of Julia on the wall, the image Edward had avoided looking at for years, which he kept there more out of obligation than a desire to remember. The boy said with his still childish and imperfect voice, "Mommy, pretty. Dad sad for Mommy. Me sad too." Edward felt his throat tighten. For the first time, father and son spoke about the woman they had both lost. Gabriel had never known Julia, but he carried her absence. In a way Edward had never stopped to consider. The boy missed her too, carried the emptiness too. Edward pulled his son onto his lap, and with tears streaming down his face, told him about his mother. How kind she was, how she loved music, how she dreamed of being a mother, how she would have loved Gabriel with all the intensity in the universe. Gabriel listened intently, absorbing every word as if they were treasures. When Edward finished, the boy wiped the tears from his father's face and said something that changed everything. "Mommy happy that Daddy loves me. Now, me happy too." They were simple words, but they carried a wisdom that only children possess. Julia wouldn't be happy seeing Edward mired in guilt and distance. She would be happy seeing him love his son, seeing him live, seeing him be present. That conversation marked a turning point. Edward began to remove the coldness he had imposed on the house. He brought in colors, plants, life. He hired fewer staff and started doing more things himself, like making Gabriel's breakfast, helping him pick out clothes, putting him to bed. Small acts of fatherhood that, added together, built a real relationship. Mr. Peterson, a witness to the entire transformation, confessed to Edward that he had always known there was something human hidden beneath that facade of control. But he also acknowledged his own mistake. He had been so rigid in enforcing the rules that he had almost prevented the miracle from happening. Edward forgave him, saying they had all failed, including himself. The point was no longer to blame, but to learn and move forward. One Sunday in October, Edward hosted a lunch at the mansion. He invited Maria, Grandma Gloria, Gabriel's therapists, and a few close friends. It was an attempt to build something the house had never had: community, warmth, belonging. Gabriel was ecstatic, running among the guests, talking non-stop, showing off his toys, playing tunes on the small piano Edward had bought. During lunch, Edward stood up and asked for everyone's attention. They all fell silent. He thanked each of them for being there, but reserved special words for Maria. He said she had taught him something that all the business books and expensive consultants never could: that power isn't about controlling everything, but about having the courage to act when necessary. That wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in human connections. That wisdom doesn't come from titles, but from sensitivity. Maria, embarrassed, tried to downplay it, but Edward insisted. He announced he was creating an institute in Julia's name, dedicated to helping children with questionable diagnoses get quality second opinions. Maria would be a consultant, her experience and intuition guiding the project. She tried to refuse, saying she had no training, but Edward was firm. "Your training is exactly what we need, the ability to see the obvious when all the experts are blind." Grandma Gloria, sitting next to her granddaughter, cried with pride. She held Maria's hand tightly, the same hand that had once cleaned so many floors, now being recognized for saving a life. The grandmother whispered something only Maria heard. "I always knew you were special, my child. I always knew." The following months brought more progress. Gabriel started at a regular school with specialized support. He made friends, learned to read, and discovered he loved to draw. Edward attended every school meeting, knew every teacher, and followed every bit of progress. He had become the father he should have been from the start. But not everything was perfect. Gabriel still faced challenges. His speech, though constantly improving, had its difficulties. Some sounds were harder, some words got mixed up. There was also the emotional trauma of years spent in isolation, occasional nightmares, moments of insecurity, irrational fears. Edward learned to be patient, not to seek immediate solutions, to simply be present in the difficult moments. Maria remained a constant presence. She had become the bridge between the world Gabriel knew and the new world he was exploring. When the boy had doubts, fears, or confusion, she was the one he turned to first. Edward felt no jealousy about this. On the contrary, he was grateful. Gabriel now had what he always needed: multiple sources of love and support. A year after the discovery, on Gabriel's 7th birthday, Edward threw a party. Nothing ostentatious, just close family and friends. Maria was there with Grandma Gloria, now recovered and stronger. The therapists were there. Mr. Peterson and other household staff were there. It was a simple gathering, but full of genuine affection. During the party, Gabriel asked to make a speech. Edward was surprised but gave him the floor. The boy, holding a toy microphone, said in his still childish but clear voice, "I want to say thank you. Thank you to Daddy, who loves me. Thank you to Maria, who saved me. Thank you to Grandma Gloria, who is good. Thank you to everyone who helps me. I'm happy now. Before, I didn't know what happy was. Now, I know." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Edward hugged his son tightly, feeling gratitude for every second of this new life they were building together. Maria cried discreetly, but they were tears of joy. Grandma Gloria prayed silently, thanking God for guiding her granddaughter on that crucial day. The investigation into the fraudulent clinic resulted in criminal charges. Several doctors lost their licenses, the clinic was shut down, and dozens of families received settlements. Edward used part of his fortune to fund proper treatments for the other victims of the scheme. It wasn't about money, it was about justice, about preventing other children from suffering as Gabriel had. The institute in Julia's name was officially inaugurated in a simple but emotional ceremony. Edward spoke about his wife, about how she would have loved this project, about how every child helped would be a tribute to her memory. Maria, now an official consultant, used her story to encourage other healthcare professionals and caregivers to trust their instincts, to question diagnoses when something didn't feel right, to put the well-being of children above protocols and hierarchies. Gabriel, present at the inauguration, cut the symbolic ribbon alongside his father. He was a completely different boy from the one who had lived in silence a year ago. He talked, laughed, interacted, lived. His transformation was a living testament that sometimes miracles happen, not through large institutions or infinite resources, but through ordinary people who refuse to accept suffering as inevitable. Edward learned to forgive himself for the mistakes of the past. He still carried the pain of losing Julia, but now he could remember her with love instead of guilt. He visited her grave regularly, took Gabriel with him, and told stories about his mother. The boy grew up knowing Julia through his father's memories, through photos, through the love everyone had for her. One evening, months later, Edward and Gabriel were in the garden looking at the stars. The boy, now speaking much better, asked, "Daddy, is Mommy in the stars?" Edward smiled and replied, "I think she's everywhere there's love, Gabriel. She's here, with me, with you, with Maria, with everyone who cares about each other." The boy thought for a moment and said, "So she's really spread out. There's a lot of love." Edward laughed, a genuine light laugh. "Yes, son, there's a lot of love. And the more love we give, the more she spreads." Gabriel nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the stars in silence. But now the silence was a choice, not a prison. They could talk whenever they wanted, and they often did. But they also knew how to appreciate shared peace, that connection that needs no words. Maria, visiting the house at that moment, watched father and son from a distance. Grandma Gloria was by her side, leaning on her cane. The two women exchanged a look of understanding. They had made a difference. They had changed a life that, in turn, changed other lives. Maria's courage to act that day had created a ripple effect that would spread for years, through the institute, through the families helped, through the love Gabriel would bring into the world. Grandma Gloria touched her granddaughter's arm and said, "You remember when you were little and you'd ask me what your purpose in life was? I told you you'd find out when the time was right. I think the time has come, don't you?" Maria smiled, her eyes welling up. "Yes, Grandma, I think so." The next 2 years brought stability and growth. Gabriel became an exemplary student with a special talent for art. He drew obsessively, creating entire worlds on paper. Edward hung every drawing in the house, turning the cold, white walls into colorful galleries of childish creativity. It was the best decoration that mansion had ever had. Edward also changed professionally. He continued to run his businesses, but with a different perspective. He invested more in social projects, used his influence to advocate for causes related to children's health, and became an active voice against medical fraud. His story with Gabriel, which he initially wanted to keep private, became public when he realized that sharing it could help other parents question diagnoses, seek second opinions, and not passively accept what experts told them. Maria went back to school. With financial support from Edward and her own desire to grow, she enrolled in an LPN program. She wanted to understand the human body more deeply, to have formal knowledge to complement her natural intuition. Grandma Gloria, now healthy and active, constantly encouraged her, saying it was never too late to learn. Gabriel, at 9 years old, wrote an essay at school about heroes. Unlike most kids who chose superheroes from movies, he wrote about Maria. He described how she saved him when no one else saw his suffering, how she had the courage to risk everything to help him, how she gave him not just his hearing, but hope. The teacher, moved, shared the essay with Edward, who had it framed and gave it to Maria as a gift. She hung the essay on the wall of her apartment, now larger and in a better neighborhood, but still in Queens. She didn't want to stray from her roots, from the people who shaped her. Every morning, upon waking and seeing that text written in Gabriel's imperfect handwriting, she remembered that every choice matters, every act of courage reverberates, every moment of compassion builds bridges between worlds that seemed eternally separate. Edward never remarried. Some friends tried to introduce him to women, but he politely declined. Julia had left an indelible mark on his heart, and he was at peace with that. His focus was Gabriel, the Institute, his work redirected toward greater purposes. Maybe someday someone would come into his life, but it wasn't a priority. He had learned that love manifests in many forms, and he already had enough love in his life through his son and the genuine people who surrounded them. One spring afternoon, 3 years after the day that changed everything, Edward, Gabriel, and Maria visited a park. Gabriel ran free, interacting with other children, shouting with joy on the playground equipment. Edward and Maria sat on a bench watching. He turned to her and said, "Have you ever thought that if you had chosen security over courage, none of this would exist?" Maria thought for a moment and replied, "I think about it every day, and I'm thankful I had enough faith to choose right." Edward nodded. "You know, for years I believed that power meant controlling everything. I thought money and resources would solve any problem, but you taught me that the biggest transformations come from the smallest people doing the right things. You had no power, no money, no influence, but you had something I had lost, humanity." Maria blushed at the compliment. "Mr. Miller, I just did what anyone should do." Edward shook his head. "No, most people would have looked the other way. They would have thought, it's not my problem, not my responsibility. You chose to see. You chose to act. You chose to risk. And because of that, a life was saved. Maybe many lives, through the Institute. That's not small, Maria. That's extraordinary." Gabriel came running back, pulling them both by the hand. "Let's play catch. Come on." The three of them went to the open field, laughing, stumbling, having fun in a simple, genuine way. There in that moment, there was no boss and employee, rich and poor, savior and saved. There were just three people who cared about each other, united by a journey that had transformed them forever. As the sun began to set, painting the New York sky in shades of orange and pink, the three of them headed home. In the mansion that was no longer cold but full of life, Gabriel went straight to his room to get ready for dinner. Edward walked Maria to the door, and before she left, he held her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said. Simply. Maria smiled. "The thanks are all mine. You gave me purpose, you and Gabriel." She walked out the door, heading for the bus stop under the colorful sky. Grandma Gloria was waiting for her at home with dinner ready. Edward went back inside, where Gabriel was already calling for help picking out his clothes for the next day. The house echoed with the sounds of life, of love, of hope. And somewhere, perhaps among the stars or in the hearts of those who loved her, Julia smiled, knowing that her son and her husband had finally found their way back to each other. Years later, when Gabriel became an adult and looked back, he would understand the magnitude of what happened that day. He would understand that Maria not only gave him back his hearing, but she gave him back his life, and that Edward not only became a better father, but he became a better man. Stories like this don't have grand endings with fireworks and applause. They have quiet endings, made of shared everyday moments, of love built day by day, of gratitude whispered in nightly prayers. And maybe, just maybe, the real miracle wasn't the recovery of hearing. The real miracle was the recovery of humanity, of connection, of the ability to see one another beyond appearances and convenience. Maria saw Gabriel when he was invisible. Edward learned to see Maria when she was invisible. And they all learned that sometimes the greatest transformations come from the smallest hands, guided by the greatest of all forces, the love that refuses to give up. 2 years had passed since that transformative day, and the New York spring brought with it an air of renewal that seemed to extend beyond the flowers blooming in the mansion's gardens. Gabriel was 8 years old, and his progress was remarkable. He spoke with growing clarity, though he still carried little quirks in his pronunciation that made him unique. Edward used to say that those little stumbles in his words were precious reminders of where they came from and how far they had come together. But on that September morning, something different hung in the air. Gabriel woke up quieter than usual, refused breakfast, and sat at his bedroom window, staring at the grey sky. Edward noticed the change immediately. He approached carefully, sitting beside his son without a word, just waiting. He had learned that sometimes a silent presence spoke louder than 1,000 questions. After long minutes, Gabriel finally spoke, his voice small and hesitant. "Dad, there's a presentation at school. The moms are going to sing with their kids. All the moms." The sentence hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Edward felt his heart clench. There were moments like this, inevitable, where Julia's absence became palpable again. He hugged his son, not knowing exactly what to say. "I know it hurts, son. I miss her too, every single day." Gabriel snuggled into his father's embrace, the tears finally escaping. "But I never heard her voice, Dad. Everyone talks about how their moms sing, and I'll never hear my mom sing. Ever." The pain in the boy's voice was deep, ancient, the kind of loss that has no easy fix. Edward held back his own tears to be strong for his son, but inside he was shattered. He took Gabriel to the room he had kept locked for years, Julia's old studio. There, preserved like sacred relics, were her things: clothes, books, notebooks, and a special box that Edward had never had the courage to open. Today would be different. With trembling hands, he opened the box. Inside, he found CDs Julia had recorded during her pregnancy. She had done it as a personal project, recording lullabies, stories, and messages for the baby she was expecting. Edward knew they existed but had never been able to listen to them. It would mean facing the pain in a way he had always avoided. But Gabriel needed it. He needed to know his mother, even if only through recorded echoes. The two sat on the floor of the dusty studio, surrounded by Julia's memories. Edward put the first CD into the old player. There was a moment of tense silence, and then her voice filled the room. "Hello, my love. It's Mommy. Today you're 5 months old in my belly, and I can't stop thinking about what it will be like to meet you. Your daddy says you're going to be beautiful, but I know you'll be so much more than that. You're going to be loved, always." Gabriel stopped breathing. His eyes widened, fixed on the stereo as if he could see his mother through it. Edward was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face without restraint. Julia's voice continued, singing a lullaby with that sweetness he had loved so much. Gabriel stood up slowly and touched the player with reverence, as if it were something sacred. "It's her," he whispered, mesmerized. "It's Mommy." Edward nodded, unable to speak. The two of them stayed there for hours, listening to every recording. Julia talked about her dreams for the baby, about the love she felt, about how she imagined the future. There was laughter, moments where she sang just to soothe the baby in her womb, declarations of love for Edward that made him remember why he had fallen in love with her. When the last CD finished, Gabriel looked at his father with a transformed expression. "She had the most beautiful voice in the world, and she loved me. Even without knowing me, she loved me." Edward hugged his son tightly. "She loved you more than anything, Gabriel, and wherever she is, she still loves you." The boy nestled into the hug, and for the first time since the pain of his mother's absence had hit him that morning, he smiled. But then Gabriel said something that caught Edward off guard. "Dad, can I take the CD to school? I want everyone to hear my mum's voice. I want her to sing with me at the presentation, even if it's through the recording." Edward hesitated. Those recordings were private, intimate treasures. Exposing them to the world felt like a violation. But looking into his son's hopeful eyes, he understood. They weren't his to keep. They were Gabriel's. They were the inheritance Julia had left. "Of course, son. We'll make it happen." In the following days, Edward spoke with the school. He explained the situation, asking for permission for Gabriel to use the recording in the presentation. The principal, moved by the story, not only agreed but offered all the necessary support. The presentation would be adapted to include that special moment. Maria, upon hearing about the situation, went to the house immediately. She found Gabriel more excited, but still dealing with a mix of emotions. She sat with him in the living room and spoke with that profound simplicity that characterized her. "You know, Gabriel, I never met your mom, but every time I look at you, I see her love. It's in your every gesture, in every smile. The people we love never really leave us. They live inside us." Gabriel hugged Maria tightly. "You're my mom too, in a different way. You saved me." The words hit Maria hard. She looked at Edward, who was watching the scene with emotion. There was no jealousy there, no competition. There was only gratitude for the network of love that supported this child. "I'm so happy to be a part of your life, my love. So happy." The night before the presentation, Edward couldn't sleep. He relived every memory of Julia, every shared moment, every plan they had made together. She should have been there. She should have been alive, healthy, preparing her son for that performance. But life had other plans, and he had to accept that not everything we lose comes back, but everything we love remains in some way. He went into Gabriel's room and found the boy awake too. The two of them talked in the dark, sharing memories, fears, hopes. Gabriel confessed he was afraid of disappointing his mother, of not being good enough. Edward held his son's hands and said with all the conviction he had, "Gabriel, you are exactly what your mother dreamed of. Brave, kind, full of life. She would be so proud. So incredibly proud." The day of the presentation arrived with a surprisingly blue sky. Edward, Maria, and Grandma Gloria went to the school together. The auditorium was packed with families, and the energy was celebratory. When it was Gabriel's turn, a respectful silence fell over the room. The teacher briefly explained the situation, preparing everyone for something different. Gabriel walked onto the stage, small and brave. Edward felt his heart was about to pound out of his chest. The boy held a microphone in one hand and the remote for the sound system in the other. He took a deep breath and spoke to the audience, his voice clear despite his nervousness. "My mom can't be here today. She passed away when I was born, but she left me something very special. She left me her voice. And today, I want you all to meet the most amazing woman in the world." He pressed play. Julia's voice filled the auditorium, singing a soft, melodious lullaby. The impact was immediate. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Gabriel began to sing along, his childish voice blending with his mother's in an impossible and perfect harmony. Mother and son, separated by life but united by music, created a moment of pure magic. Edward cried without trying to hide it. Maria held Grandma Gloria's hand, both with tears streaming down their faces. All around, mothers hugged their children tighter. Fathers discreetly wiped their eyes. This wasn't just a boy singing with his mother's recording. It was a testament that love transcends life, that true connections never die, that even in the deepest absence, there is presence. When the music ended, there was a second of absolute silence. Then the audience erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite applause of a school performance. It was the applause of touched hearts, of souls recognizing something sacred. Gabriel took a bow, tears and smiles mixing on his face, and walked off the stage straight into his father's arms. "Did you see?" Gabriel whispered in Edward's ear. "I sang with Mommy." Edward couldn't speak, just nodded, holding his son as if he were the most precious thing in the universe, because he was. Maria joined the hug, and the three of them stood there, a family formed not by blood but by choice and by love. After the presentation, several families approached Edward. They wanted to thank him, to say that the moment had made them value the presence of their loved ones more. One mother confessed that she was so absorbed in her work that she forgot to sing to her daughter, and that Gabriel's performance had awakened her. A father said he would call his own mother, from whom he had been distant for years. The suffering of Gabriel and Edward had transformed into inspiration for others. That night, back at the mansion, they organized a special dinner. Maria brought Grandma Gloria, and Edward also invited some close staff, including Mr. Peterson, who had become almost part of the family. It was a celebration not just of the performance, but of everything they had built together. During dinner, Grandma Gloria asked to speak. With her voice still strong despite her age, she said, "You know, I've lost many people in my life. My parents, my husband, then my daughter and son-in-law, Maria's parents. I've learned that death is a part of life, but love is greater than death. Julia may be gone, but her love lives on. It's in Edward, who has become a wonderful father. It's in Gabriel, who is growing up full of kindness. It's in Maria, who had the courage to do what was right. Love never dies, it just transforms. Her words resonated deeply with everyone. Edward stood up and walked to the wall where he kept his favorite photo of Julia. The same one Gabriel had pointed to years ago. But now, instead of pain, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for having loved and been loved. Gratitude for the son she gave him. Gratitude for the journey that transformed him. "Julia," he said aloud, addressing the photo, "I hope wherever you are you can see the man I've become, the father I've learned to be. Our son is incredible. He has your kindness, your courage, your light. And although you're not here physically, you are present in every decision I make, in every hug I give, in every moment I choose love over fear. Thank you for him. Thank you for teaching me what really matters." Gabriel approached his father, and together they looked at the photo. "I love you, Mommy," the boy said. "Even without knowing you, I love you so much." Edward hugged his son, and there, before that image frozen in time, past and present met in peace. Maria watched it all from a distance, her own heart overflowing. She thought about how it all began. On that day, she decided to risk everything. It could have gone so wrong. She could have lost her job, her stability, her dignity. But she chose courage, and that choice created waves that transformed not just one life, but many. Grandma Gloria approached her granddaughter and whispered, "You did much more than save his hearing, my child. You saved an entire family." Maria smiled, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "It was God who guided me. Grandma, I just followed the path." Her grandmother shook her head. "God provides the opportunities, but we are the ones who choose to walk through the doors. You walked through when others would have run away." The following months brought a new stability. Gabriel continued to thrive in school, made loyal friends, and discovered a passion for music thanks to his mother's recordings. Edward cut back his work hours even more, prioritizing being present for every important moment, and the institute in Julia's name began to show concrete results, with dozens of families being helped. One day, Edward received a call from a mother whose son had been misdiagnosed. Thanks to the institute's work, a second opinion revealed the truth, and the boy was treated properly. The woman was crying with gratitude on the phone, saying that Gabriel and Edward had saved her son. Edward hung up the phone and sat in silence for long minutes. "Julia," he thought, "your name is saving lives. Your love is multiplying." Gabriel, who had witnessed the call, understood its significance. "Mommy is helping other boys like me, isn't she?" Edward nodded, moved. "Yes, son. She continues to make a difference, even though she's not here. Because true love never ends. It just expands." That night, for the first time in years, Edward dreamed of Julia, but it wasn't an agonizing nightmare like the ones he used to have. It was a serene dream. She was in a sunny garden, smiling, waving, and though she said nothing, he understood the message. "It's okay, you're okay. Keep living, keep loving." He woke up with a sense of peace he hadn't felt since before she was gone. The story of Edward, Gabriel, and Maria became known through the Institute. Many families asked to meet them to hear firsthand how it all happened. At first, Edward resisted, wanting to maintain their privacy, but Gabriel convinced him, "Dad, if our story can help someone not to give up, to have hope, we can't keep it to ourselves." And so they began to share. At Institute events, in talks at schools, in carefully selected interviews, always together, always honest about the mistakes, the pain, the lessons. Maria also participated, her simple yet powerful voice reminding everyone that heroes don't wear capes, they don't have superpowers. They are just ordinary people who choose to do the extraordinary. One evening, after one of these talks, a man approached Edward. He was a businessman like him, wealthy, powerful, used to controlling everything. The man confessed that he was living exactly what Edward had lived, distant from his son, obsessed with work, thinking that providing financially was enough. The talk had been a wake-up call. He wanted to change. He wanted to be present. He asked for advice. Edward looked at the man and saw his reflection from years ago. He shared his journey with brutal honesty, not sparing his own mistakes. He said that money can't buy back lost time, that titles can't replace hugs, that legacies are built in small moments, not grand gestures. The man left transformed, and Edward knew that Julia would be smiling to see how her tragic departure was generating so much good. Gabriel grew not just in age, but in wisdom. At 9, he had an impressive emotional maturity, a result of the hardships he had faced early on. He became the defender of marginalized students at school, the friend to those who had no friends, the voice for the silenced. Maria saw in him a reflection of everything she hoped a child would become: compassionate, brave, and aware. On a quiet afternoon, the three of them were in the mansion's garden. Grandma Gloria dozed in a comfortable chair, the sun filtering through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow. Gabriel was playing with a dog Edward had finally agreed to adopt. Maria and Edward were talking quietly, watching the scene. "You know you saved a lot more than my hearing, right?" Gabriel's voice interrupted the adult's conversation. The boy approached, the dog bouncing beside him. "You saved my dad too. He was sad, now he's happy." Maria felt her eyes well up. "Your dad is strong, Gabriel. He just needed time." Gabriel shook his head with determination. "No, he needed you. We both did." Edward pulled his son into a hug. He extended his free hand to Maria, and she took it. The three of them stood there, united, a constellation of souls that fate had intertwined in an impossible and perfect way. The sun was setting, painting the New York sky in shades of gold and purple, and for the first time in so long, there was no more weight in the air, only lightness. Years would pass. Gabriel would grow up to become a musician, honoring his mother's love for music. Edward would grow old alongside his son, present for every step. Maria would fulfill her dream of becoming a nurse, working at the institute, saving other children. Grandma Gloria would live long enough to see the great-granddaughter Maria would have, closing the circle of love and care that defined generations. But in that moment, in the garden illuminated by the sunset, none of them were thinking about the future. They were fully present, embracing, grateful, because they finally understood the deepest truth, that miracles don't happen in spite of pain, but through it. That transformations don't come from grand gestures, but from small acts of courage repeated day after day. That family isn't just who shares your blood, but who chooses to stay when it would be easier to leave. And that in the end, love is the only force capable of overcoming even the deepest silence, the most painful absence, the most impossible distance. Julia's love that lived on. Edward's love that he finally learned to express. Maria's love that saved when no one else saw. Gabriel's love that healed wounds that even time could not. There in that New York garden, as the city pulsed around them with its millions of intertwined stories, a simple truth was revealed. Sometimes we are broken to be rebuilt stronger. Sometimes we lose to learn what truly matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, the happy ending isn't the one we planned, but the one we build with the pieces life gives us. And that, they all discovered, was more than enough. It was everything. End of story. Hey everyone, we hope the complete journey of Edward, Gabriel, and Maria touched the deepest corners of your heart. If you were moved by this story of loss, redemption, courage, and a love that transcends all barriers, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which moment resonated with your soul the most. Was it Gabriel's pain at wanting to hear his mother's voice? Edward's transformation from a cold businessman to a loving father? Maria's unwavering courage, or that magical moment when mother and son sang together across time? Every day, we bring you stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit, the capacity to start over, and the transformative power of true love. Your presence here matters, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where another emotional story is waiting to touch your heart.